The Zenthari diplomatic corps had spent the better part of 3 millennia perfecting the art of civilized discourse. Their crystalline towers on Nexus Prime gleamed with the accumulated wisdom of 1,000 conquered species. Music, each diplomatic victory archived in quantum storage for future reference. Ambassador Kethwar adjusted his ceremonial robes with the practiced ease of someone who had negotiated the surrender of 17 star systems before his morning nutrition cycle. The galaxy, he reflected with satisfaction, was a remarkably orderly place when everyone understood their position in the grand hierarchy, which made the humans such a delightfully puzzling anomaly. The Earth delegation has arrived. Ambassador, his age chitted, mandibles clicking with barely concealed amusement. There, exactly as reported, Kethwar's optical senses dimmed in what passed for a smile. Among his species, the humans had been members of the Galactic Union for barely 2 standard cycles, having stumbled onto the galactic stage with all the grace of a Therian ox in a crystal garden. Their first diplomatic mission had been memorably entertaining. Their lead negotiator had actually asked if the refreshments were gluten-free during a treaty signing that would determine the fate of 3 colony worlds. The recording still circulated among diplomatic staff as a master class. Music and primitive naivety, show them to Conference Chamber 7. Kethwar instructed the one with the uncomfortable seating, let them understand their place from the moment they sit down. The chamber's design was a subtle music work of art, every angle calculated to induce psychological discomfort, every surface reflecting light in ways that suggested vast power. Barely restrained, the hegemony had perfected such techniques over eons of peaceful expansion. And GT, music. And GT, a term that meant exactly what it sounded like, provided one understood that peace was simply war conducted through more civilized means. Ambassador Marcus Chen entered the chamber with the sort of easy stride that immediately marked him as either supremely confident or utterly clueless. His delegation followed in a loose formation that would have horrified any proper military observer. No clear hierarchy, no formal protocols, just a group of humans chatting among themselves like tourists visiting the museum. The lead diplomat wore what appeared to be an off-the-rack business suit that probably cost less than Kethwar's ceremonial cufflinks. Folks, Chen announced with the sort of enthusiasm typically reserved for sporting events or breakfast cereals. Thanks for having us. I have to say, this place is something else. The architecture is absolutely stunning. Who was the designer? I'd love to get their contact information for my wife. She's redoing our kitchen back home. Kethwar's optical sensors flickered with confusion. The human was either engaging in some form of primitive humor or genuinely believed this was an appropriate topic for interstellar diplomacy. Admiral Thexmal, representing the Krillian Naval Authority, made a sound that might have been disgust or possibly just his species' equivalent of clearing one's throat. Ambassador Chen Kethwar began, his translator rendering his words in the flat, emotionless tones preferred for formal discourse. We have gathered to address certain irregularities in human expansion patterns. Your species has been making rather ambitious claims regarding music trade routes in the outer spiral. Oh, that. Chen laughed, a sound that somehow managed to echo inappropriately in the solemn chamber. Yeah, we figured we'd ask. I mean, the worst you could say is no, right? My grandmother always said you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. She was a bowler, actually. Terrible at it, but she had the right attitude. Counselor Vashti, whose species had been perfecting the art of economic warfare since before humans discovered fire, leaned forward with predatory interest. Your expansion requests are substantial. 17 new trade routes, mining rights to 14 systems, and what your documentation rather boldly refers to as preferential status for human commercial ventures. Well, when you put it like that, it does sound like a lot, Chen admitted, scratching his head in a gesture that would have been endearing if it weren't so completely inappropriate for the setting. But hey, we're new to this whole galactic community thing. We figured we'd start big and work our way down. That's negotiating 101, right? The assembled alien dignitaries exchanged glances that would have been meaningful if any of them had possessed anything resembling conventional facial expressions. The humans, meanwhile, seemed utterly oblivious to the growing tension in the room. One of Chen's aides, a woman who had introduced herself simply as Elena, was actually taking pictures of the chamber's architecture with what appeared to be a primitive handheld device. Perhaps Admiral Thexmal interjected, his voice carrying the sort of barely contained menace that had convinced 47 species to surrender without firing a shot. You misunderstand the nature of galactic diplomacy, Ambassador Chen. The outer spiral trade routes have been regulated by treaty for over 600 years. They are not simply available for the asking. Oh, we understand, Chen replied with the same cheerful tone he might use to discuss the weather. But see, here's the thing, those treaties were signed before we joined the Union, and according to Article 12 of the Galactic Charter, new member species have the right to petition for resource allocation, reviews, music. I have to admit, Elena here did most of the research. She's got a real head for this legal stuff. Elena looked up from her picture-taking and beamed. Thanks, boss. I actually found some really interesting precedents. Did you know the Vorfak Consortium claimed exclusive mining rights to the Kepler Nebula back in 2847? But the Adjudication Council ruled that enough. Counselor Vashti interrupted, his translator adding harmonics that suggested barely controlled rage. This is not some primitive marketplace where you can simply demand whatever catches your fancy. The hegemony has invested considerable resources in maintaining stability in the outer spiral. Your requests are not merely ambitious, they are insulting. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. And GT, music. And GT. This was the moment Kethwar realized where the humans would finally understand their position in the galactic order. Species that pushed too hard too fast typically found themselves facing what the diplomatic corps euphemistically referred to as enforcement actions. Nothing too dramatic, a trade embargo here, a few strategic military exercises near their colonies there, just enough pressure to encourage more reasonable behavior. Chen's expression grew thoughtful. I see, so what you're saying is that our requests are being denied based on existing arrangements, and if we persist, there might be consequences. Your species shows promise, Admiral Thexmal said, his tone suggesting a teacher addressing a particularly slow student, but promise must be tempered. With wisdom, the galaxy has certain established patterns, those who respect these patterns prosper, those who do not. He let the threat hang in the air. Like a toxic cloud, it was beautifully executed. Keth War had to admit, the Krillian admiral had perfected this particular intimidation technique over centuries of successful subjugation campaigns. Chen nodded slowly as if processing some profound philosophical truth. Right. So basically you're saying that might makes right, and you folks have more might than we do, is that the gist of it? That is a rather crude oversimplification, Keth War replied, though privately he had to admire the human's directness, but essentially accurate. The galaxy operates on principles of order and hierarchy. Your species, while charming in its enthusiasm, must learn to accept its place in that order. Chen glanced around at his delegation, who had been listening to the exchange with expressions of mild interest, as if watching a moderately entertaining theatrical performance. Well, that's certainly one way to look at it. Elena, what do you think? Elena had finished taking her pictures and was now examining the composition of the chamber walls with what appeared to be a small handheld scanner. From a historical perspective, it's actually a fairly common pattern. Established powers maintain control through a combination of economic pressure and implied military force. Classic hegemonic stability. Music theory. Really? Right. Right, Chen mused. And I suppose if we don't play along, you folks might decide to demonstrate just how much more mighty you are than us backwater primitives. The silence that followed was pregnant with menace. Several of the alien delegates shifted in their seats, or whatever passed for seats in their particular anatomical configurations. This was it, Keth Music War thought. The moment when reality would finally penetrate the human's peculiar mix of optimism and naivety. Instead, Chen started laughing. It wasn't the nervous laughter of someone finally grasping their precarious situation. It was the deep, genuine laughter of someone who had just heard an excellent joke. His entire delegation joined in, creating a chorus of human amusement that seemed to bounce off the chamber's intimidating walls, music, and transform them into something almost welcoming. Oh, that's rich, Chen gasped, wiping tears from his eyes. Sorry, I don't mean to be rude. It's just, well, this is exactly what Command said would happen. Elena reminded me to buy General Morrison a drink when we get back. She called it right down to the veiled threats and everything. The laughter died away, but Chen's expression had changed. The bumbling enthusiasm was gone, replaced by something that made Keth Voss' optical sensors automatically adjust to focus more clearly. It was like watching a predator remove its camouflage. Here's the thing, folks, Chen continued, his voice carrying a new quality that somehow made the enormous chamber feel smaller and more cramped. We've been playing this game for exactly as long as we've been members of your little club. 2 years of smiling and nodding and pretending to be impressed by your threats, and you know what? It's been educational, really, genuinely educational. Elena had produced a small device that was projecting holographic displays faster than the alien delegates could track star charts, fleet positions, communication intercepts, economic data, a cascade of information that painted a picture none of them had Expected. See, the funny thing about being underestimated, Chen continued, is that people tend to say the most interesting things around you, like how Admiral Fexmol's invincible Third Fleet hasn't actually engaged in combat for over 40 years because most species surrender the moment they see it, or how Counselor Vashti's economic music sanctions work so well because they're backed up by the implicit threat of orbital bombardment. Vashti's breathing apparatus made a sound like steam escaping from a damaged pipe. How could you possibly know that? Well, it turns out that when you treat someone like a harmless primitive, they can walk into some pretty interesting places without anyone music paying much attention. Alina here has been having fascinating conversations with your staff, haven't you, Alina? Oh yes, Alina replied with the same cheerful enthusiasm she'd shown while photographing the architecture. Your communication security is really quite quaint, very traditional. My grandmother could probably crack most of it, and she's been dead for 15 years. The chamber's lighting seemed to flicker, though that might have been Keth Voss' optical sensors struggling to process what he was witnessing. The humans were no longer sitting in their chairs like supplicants awaiting judgment. They were standing, and their posture had shifted into something that registered on a primal level as dangerous. The thing is, Chen continued, we didn't come here to threaten anybody. Humans are remarkably peaceful considering our background. We prefer talking to shooting, negotiating to conquering, but in this is important, we're really, really good at shooting and conquering. When the talking music breaks down, a new holographic display materialized above the conference music table. It showed the current positions of every major fleet in the sector: the Krillian Third Fleet, the Hegemony Enforcement Division, the Zentari Diplomatic Protection Squadron, all clearly marked and tracked in real time. Also clearly marked were the positions of what the display identified as human observer units. Music, there were a lot of them. You see, Alina explained with the tone of a professor delivering a lecture to particularly dense students. Earth is what we call a Class 12 death world. That's a technical term meaning planet that actively tries to kill everything living on it. Music, our ancestors didn't just survive on Earth, they thrived. They turned a ball of rock covered in poisonous atmosphere, deadly radiation, unstable weather patterns, and predatory megafauna into a garden world with a population of 8 billion. She paused to let that sink in before continuing, we've been fighting wars for our entire recorded history, not because we're aggressive. Well, not primarily, but because that's what you do when your planet keeps trying to music murder. You and your neighbors keep trying to steal your resources. We got very, very good at it. Admiral Fexmol made a sound that his translator couldn't quite render. His species had conquered 47 star systems, but they had done so against opponents who were essentially peaceful merchants and farmers with minimal military experience. The idea of facing an opponent that had literally evolved for warfare was apparently requiring some mental adjustment. But here is the really interesting part, Chen said, and his smile had taken on qualities that would have given a Terran shark pause for thought. We're not just good at the shooting part, we're excellent at the thinking part. Strategy, tactics, logistics, intelligence gathering, all the boring stuff that actually wins wars. Elena. Show them the fun slides. Holographic displays shifted to show detailed schematics of various alien military installations, not just general layouts but security protocols, personnel rotations, defensive capabilities, and most disturbingly, what appeared to be comprehensive vulnerability analyses. We've been mapping your entire military infrastructure for 2 years, Elena explained cheerfully, not because we plan to attack it, you understand, it's just what we do, professional habit. Humans have a saying, hope for the best, prepare for the worst. We were hoping for the best. The silence in the chamber was so complete that Keth Voss could hear the quantum processors in the walls cycling through their calculations. Every delegate was staring at the displays, trying to process the implications of what they were seeing. Now Chen continued, I want to be absolutely clear about something. We don't want a war. Wars are expensive, messy, and frankly bad for business. What we want is respect, not fear, not submission, just the basic respect you'd show to equals. We want fair trade agreements, reasonable territorial boundaries, and the courtesy of being consulted before major decisions that affect human space. He gestured to the holographic displays, which were now showing fleet movement patterns that suggested the humans had been tracking every major military unit in the sector for months. But if you insist on treating us like primitive savages who need to be kept in line with threats and intimidation, well, we're really good at being primitive savages. It's what music we were before we became civilized, and the civilization part is mostly just good manners, Counselor. Vashti had managed to regain some composure, though his breathing apparatus was still making distressed noises. This is exactly the sort of behavior that proves you're not ready for full membership in the galactic community. Civilized species don't spy on their neighbors. They don't threaten established order. They don't, Counselor. Chen interrupted gently, respectfully. Your definition of civilized seems to be does what we tell them to do. That's not civilization. That's just successful bullying, and humans have been dealing with bullies for a very long time. The holographic display changed again, this time showing what appeared to be a comprehensive analysis of the galactic economy, trade routes, resource flows, manufacturing centers, financial networks, all mapped out in stunning detail. See, the thing about bullies, Elena added, is that they're usually not as strong as they pretend to be. They maintain control through reputation and intimidation, but once someone calls their bluff, she didn't need to finish the sentence. The implications were clear enough from the economic data floating above the table. The hegemony's trade empire was impressively vast, but surprisingly fragile. The Krillian military was powerful but overextended. The Zentari diplomatic network was sophisticated but relied heavily on member species who were loyal primarily out of fear rather than genuine alliance. We could crash your economy tomorrow, Chen said conversationally. Not through military action. That would be crude, but humans have been playing economic warfare games since before we had writing. We could manipulate your trade routes, destabilize your currency exchanges, and turn your member species against each other with a few carefully placed rumors and some creative accounting. He paused, then smiled that unsettling smile again. But we won't, because that would be uncivilized. Instead, we're going to offer you a choice. Option 1, we can rewrite the rules of galactic diplomacy together as equals, fair trade, mutual respect, shared prosperity, everyone wins. Option 2, we can demonstrate exactly why you don't want to make Deathworlders drop the mask. The chamber fell silent again. But this time the silence had a different quality. It was the silence of predators reassessing their prey and discovering that what they had music taken for weakness was actually restraint. Admiral Feximer was the first to speak. Your military capabilities, the intelligence networks, how long have you been planning this? Planning what? Chen asked innocently. We're not planning anything hostile, we're just prepared for any eventuality. Alina, how long would you say we've been prepared? Oh, since about 15 minutes after we joined the Union, Alina replied cheerfully. The first time someone music mentioned enforcement actions in our presence, really, it seemed prudent to make sure we understood what that meant. She gestured to the displays, which were now showing detailed analyses of every major military engagement, the sector for the past century, victory, conditions, casualty ratios, tactical innovations, strategic failures, all cataloged and cross-referenced with current capabilities. Your admirals, Third Fleet, for instance, impressive ships, excellent crews, beautiful formations, but they've never faced an opponent that fought back effectively. Most of their victories were against species that had essentially no military tradition. The few times they encountered serious resistance, the engagements lasted significantly longer than projected and casualties were higher than anticipated. Admiral Feximel's carapace had taken on a distinctly unhealthy color. You cannot possibly be suggesting that a single human fleet could engage the Third Fleet and emerge victorious. Oh heavens, no. Chen laughed. A single human fleet would be horribly outnumbered and outdone. We'd never be that stupid. We'd use 12 fleets, attack from 6 different vectors simultaneously, and make sure you never had a chance to bring your superior numbers to bear in a single engagement. The holographic display obligingly showed exactly how such an engagement might unfold. It was, Kefler had to admit, remarkably thorough and utterly terrifying. But again, Chen continued, we don't want to fight anybody. Fighting is what you do when diplomacy fails. We're very good at diplomacy too. We just prefer to negotiate from a position of mutual respect rather than from our knees. Council of Ashti's breathing apparatus had stabilized somewhat, though he still looked like a being who had received several unpleasant surprises in rapid succession. What exactly are you proposing, Ambassador? Simple. We want to renegotiate the terms of human membership in the Union, fair representation in the Council, equitable trade agreements, territorial boundaries that reflect actual military and economic capabilities rather than historical precedent, basic stuff. Really, and if we refuse, Chen's smile never wavered, then we'll politely withdraw from the Union and make our own arrangements with individual species. Some of your member states have been sending us very interesting private communications lately. Apparently your enforcement actions aren't as popular as you might think. The silence stretched out long enough for Kefler to run several complete diplomatic scenario analysis through his neural processes. None of them ended well for the established order. The humans had outmaneuvered them completely, using their own assumptions and prejudices. Against them, I believe, Kefler said, slowly, that we may have underestimated the complexity of this situation. Not complexity, Chen corrected gently, just humans. We're not complex at all. Really, we want to trade, explore, build things, and get along with our neighbors. It's very simple. We just prefer to do it as equals rather than as subjects. Elena was packing away her devices with the efficient movements of someone who had accomplished her objectives. Oh, and one more thing, that intelligence network we mentioned, it's not going anywhere. Consider it a permanent early warning system. As long as everyone plays nicely, it just observes and reports. But if anyone decides they want to test human resolve. She left the sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear enough. So Chen said, standing and straightening his remarkably unremarkable suit jacket, shall we schedule another meeting to discuss the details? I'm thinking something a bit more informal. Maybe we could meet on my ship next time. I'd love to show you around. The engine room is particularly interesting. Elena designed some fascinating improvements to our propulsion systems. The alien delegates remained seated still, processing the complete reversal of everything they had assumed about human capabilities and intentions. Chen's delegation was already moving toward the chamber's exit with the casual confidence of beings who had accomplished exactly what they had come to do. Oh, and Ambassador Kefler Chen paused at the threshold and turned back with that same friendly smile he had worn when he entered. Your architecture really is stunning, very intimidating. I bet it works great on species that are actually intimidated by impressive surroundings. And with that, the humans were gone, leaving behind only the lingering scent of some exotic cologne, and the unmistakable sense that the galactic order had just shifted on its axis. Kefler sat in the suddenly too large chamber, staring at the space where the holographic displays had been. The humans had left no recordings, no evidence of their capabilities beyond what they had chosen to reveal. It was, he realized, the ultimate demonstration of confidence. They had shown enough to make their point, but not enough to compromise their operational security. Well, Admiral Fexmal said eventually, his translator struggling with what sounded like several different emotions simultaneously. That was educational. Indeed, Council of Ashti agreed. I believe we may need to revise our assessment protocols for newly admitted species. Kefler activated his communication systems and began composing a priority message to the Diplomatic Council. How exactly did one explain that the galaxy's newest member species had just politely informed the established music powers that they could destroy them all, but would prefer to be friends instead? The humans, he reflected, were going to make galactic politics considerably more interesting and infinitely more complicated. But perhaps, he thought as he watched the chamber's intimidating architecture seem to shrink back to merely impressive proportions, that wasn't entirely a bad thing. After all, the galaxy had been remarkably orderly for a very long time. Maybe it was due for a little chaos, preferably the kind that came with fair trade agreements and mutual respect, rather than the kind that came with orbital bombardments and collapsed economies. The humans, Kefler decided, had excellent timing and remarkable restraint. He made a mental note to ensure that future diplomatic chambers were designed with more comfortable seating. Something told him that the days of intimidation through architecture were coming to an end. History, after all, had just delivered its warning, and wise species, he reflected, learned to listen the first time